You think you're smart, boy? Judge Harold sneered, his heavy wooden gavel suspended mid-air like an executioner's axe, casting a long, jagged shadow across the polished mahogany bench. In my courtroom, we play a little game called Truth or Lie. You lie, I lock you away until your hair turns gray and your name becomes a number. You tell the truth, well, I lock you away anyway, but maybe I'll let you keep your shoelaces. Zion, a 17-year-old black kid draped in a faded, oversized gray hoodie, looked up through the dust motes dancing in the harsh fluorescent light. He didn't tremble. He didn't beg. His breathing remained eerily steady. Instead, a cold, calculating smile crept across his face, reaching eyes that looked far older than 17. Your Honor, Zion whispered, his voice slicing through the heavy, oppressive silence of the room with razor-sharp precision, let's play. The air inside Courtroom 3B of the Fulton County Superior Court was always notoriously frigid, smelling faintly of lemon polish, stale coffee, and the undeniable stench of nervous sweat. On this dreary Tuesday morning, with rain lashing against the high, frosted windows, it felt like a meat locker. The chill was highly intentional. The Honorable Judge Arthur Harold preferred his defendants cold, physically uncomfortable, and shivering. Over his 22 years on the bench, Judge Harold had cultivated a draconian reputation that terrified seasoned public defenders and sent juvenile offenders into hyperventilating panic attacks before they even crossed the threshold of the heavy, brass-studded oak doors. They called him the Grim Reaper of Fulton County, a man who viewed justice not as a blind, balanced scale, but as a rusted hammer meant to completely crush those he deemed unworthy of second chances. At the dark center of his sadistic judicial methodology was a twisted interrogation tactic he affectionately dubbed Truth or Lie. It was an egregious, borderline illegal psychological game he played almost exclusively with young, predominantly minority defendants who couldn't afford high-priced, private legal representation. Harold would flagrantly bypass the defense attorneys, leaning over his bench to speak directly to the terrified teenagers, forcing them to answer loaded, manipulative questions under the intense, blinding glare of the courtroom lights. He would trap them in impossible linguistic paradoxes, forcing them to inadvertently incriminate themselves while their overworked, underpaid public defenders sat helplessly by, too afraid of being slapped with contempt charges to intervene. But today, sitting quietly at the scarred wooden defense table, was Zion Harris. To the untrained eye and certainly to Judge Harold's heavily prejudiced gaze, Zion looked like just another bleak statistic waiting to be processed into the system. He was 17, dressed in a faded gray hoodie that swallowed his thin, wiry frame, paired with dark, faded jeans and scuffed white sneakers. He sat with his shoulders slightly slouched, staring down at the scuffed, yellowing linoleum floor. He looked like the perfect victim for Harold's predatory game. He looked entirely defeated. What Judge Harold didn't know, what the lazy, indifferent state prosecutor flipping through his phone didn't know, and what even Zion's own exhausted public defender didn't know, was that beneath that unassuming, quiet exterior operated a mind of terrifying, unprecedented brilliance. 3 years ago, Zion had been tested by a state psychologist after an astounded high school teacher noticed his bizarrely rapid completion of advanced placement standardized tests. The results of the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, WAIS IV, had deeply shocked the school district. Zion possessed an IQ of 168. He had a flawless photographic memory, capable of recalling vast, complex amounts of text with eidetic precision down to the punctuation, and an analytical processing speed that rivaled high-end supercomputers. But Zion had learned early on that in his harsh South Side neighborhood, being known as a fragile genius only made you a target for bullies and gangs. He kept his head down, purposefully lowering his grades to a respectable but unremarkable B average, hiding his immense intellect behind a quiet, invisible demeanor. That survival tactic remained in place until his older brother, Marcus, was wrongfully convicted of armed robbery. Watching his brother get swallowed whole by the ravenous prison industrial complex, hearing the cold clink of the cuffs and seeing the tears in Marcus's eyes as he was led away had ignited a quiet, burning inferno inside Zion. For the past 2 years, while other kids his age played video games, obsessed over social media, or hung out at the local mall, Zion lived in the dusty, quiet corners of the downtown public library's law section. He relentlessly devoured the Georgia Code of Criminal Procedure, memorized decades of landmark Supreme Court rulings, dissected the dense federal rules of evidence, and studied the complex psychological tactics of cross-examination. He had effectively given himself a rigorous Ivy League-level legal education by the time he was a junior in high school, using his eidetic memory to build an impenetrable fortress of legal precedent in his mind. Now, Zion was the one caught in the crosshairs. He had been arrested 3 nights prior for felony possession of stolen property and criminal trespass. The truth of the night was infuriatingly simple. Zion had been walking home from a grueling 6-hour shift at a local diner, paused to tie his unraveled shoelace near a dark Elm Street alleyway, and was suddenly swarmed by shouting police officers. A stolen, diamond-encrusted Rolex watch had been blindly tossed into the thorny bushes 10 feet away from him by the actual fleeing suspect. Because Zion vaguely matched the dispatcher's description of young black male in a dark hoodie, he was violently slammed against the freezing metal hood of a police cruiser, his cheek pressed into the rain-slicked steel, roughly cuffed, and instantly charged without so much as a basic question being asked. "All rise," the heavy-set bailiff bellowed, his deep voice echoing sharply off the dark mahogany-paneled walls. Judge Harold swept into the room, his heavy black robe billowing ominously behind him like bat wings. He was a large, imposing man with a flushed, heavily jowled face, silver hair slicked back tightly against his scalp, and eyes that held the terrifying warmth of a frozen lake. He practically threw himself into his high-backed leather chair, the leather groaning under his weight, adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses as he peered condescendingly over the towering wooden bench. "Be seated," Harold grumbled, loudly shuffling a thick stack of manila folders. He didn't even bother to look up as he spoke. Case number 44-092, State of Georgia vs. Zion Harris. Felony possession. Criminal trespass. Who do we have for the defense today? A harried, sweat-stained public defender named Mr. Gable stood up, clumsily dropping a ballpoint pen that rolled loudly across the floor. He looked like a man who hadn't slept a full night in 5 years. "Frank Gable for the defense, Your Honor. My client pleads not guilty to all charges." Harold finally slowly looked up, his icy eyes locking onto Zion's small frame. A sickening, deeply familiar smirk stretched across the judge's wrinkled face. He leaned forward, interlacing his thick, sausage-like fingers, resting his elbows heavily on the polished wood of the bench. "Not guilty, Mr. Gable." Harold chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that lacked any real humor. "Well, that's what they all say, isn't it? But looking at your young client here, I think we need to cut through all this tedious bureaucratic red tape. I think we need to have a little conversation. Just me and the boy. Man to man." Gable shifted nervously, pulling at his frayed collar. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I strongly advise against." "Sit down, Mr. Gable," Harold snapped, his voice cracking through the air like a bullwhip, "unless you want a criminal contempt charge added to your already bloated morning docket. I am conducting an informal preliminary inquiry to gauge the defendant's baseline understanding of the charges against him. Isn't that right, son?" Zion slowly, deliberately lifted his head. His dark eyes, previously cast downward in feigned submission, now met the judge's aggressive gaze with a piercing, unblinking intensity. The slouch vanished entirely. His spine straightened, aligning with a sudden, rigid perfection. The metamorphosis was subtle, but to anyone paying close attention, the terrified, scrawny kid had just been replaced by an apex predator calmly entering the hunting grounds. "Yes, Your Honor," Zion said, his voice eerily calm, smooth as glass, and chillingly polite. "I understand the charges perfectly, and I understand the true nature of your inquiry." Judge Harold leaned back, clearly pleased with himself. He thought he was dealing with just another compliant, terrified teenager ready to break under pressure. He had absolutely no idea he had just invited a grandmaster to play a game of chess, and that he had already surrendered his queen. "Good," Harold said, a wicked, triumphant gleam in his eye. "Then let's play a little game, Zion. I call it truth or lie. The rules are very simple. I ask you a question. You tell me if the premise is the truth, or a lie. If you play along, maybe I show you a sliver of leniency. If you try to play me for a fool, I will bury you so deep in the juvenile detention system you won't see actual sunlight until you're a fully grown man. Do we have an understanding? Zion's lips twitched upward into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. We have a perfect understanding, Your Honor. Let the game begin. The courtroom was utterly silent, save for the rhythmic, incredibly anxious clack 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 tapping of the court stenographer's fingers on her machine. The prosecutor, a balding, perpetually exhausted man named Davis, sat far back in his chair, rubbing his temples and staring blankly at a legal pad. He hated Judge Harold's theatrical, abusive theatrics, but he never dared to intervene. It made his job infinitely easier. The truth or lie game almost always resulted in a terrified, sobbing confession or a hopelessly tangled web of contradictory statements that practically guaranteed a swift, unbothered conviction before lunch. Let's start simple, Zion, Judge Harold said, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. You were found lurking in the alleyway on Elm Street at exactly 11:42 p.m. The stolen Rolex, valued at over $12,000, was found precisely 8 feet from where you were standing. Truth or lie? You knew the watch was there. Mr. Gable, the public defender, practically jumped out of his cheap wooden seat, knocking his briefcase over. Objection, Your Honor. You are actively interrogating my minor client without allowing me to confer with him. This flagrantly violates his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. Overruled, Harold barked, slamming his gavel down so violently the sound cracked through the room like a gunshot, making the stenographer jump. This is merely a preliminary dialogue. If the boy has nothing to hide, he has absolutely nothing to fear. Answer the question, Zion. Zion didn't even glance at his panicked lawyer. He kept his dark eyes locked squarely on the judge. His mind was moving at warp speed, instantly analyzing the deeply flawed legal architecture of the trap Harold had just set. If Zion said lie, Harold would accuse him of perjury based on the police proximity reports, claiming he was close enough that ignorance was impossible. If he said truth, it was a direct admission of guilt and possession. It was a classic Morton's fork a false dilemma explicitly designed to force a damning outcome either way, leaving the victim with no avenue of escape. Truth, Your Honor, Zion said, his voice echoing cleanly and confidently through the silent room. The public defender groaned aloud and buried his face in his hands, picturing another lost case. The prosecutor perked up from his legal pad, immediately grabbing his pen to note the confession. Judge Harold's cruel smile widened, revealing slightly yellowed teeth. He leaned back. He thought he had scored his kill in the first 2 minutes of the bout. Aha, Harold gloated, gesturing broadly with his hand. Truth. So you openly admit you knew the stolen property was there. You admit to possessing the knowledge of the stolen goods. I appreciate your honesty, son. It makes my sentencing much easier. I admit no such thing, Your Honor, Zion replied smoothly, not missing a single beat. Harold frowned, his thick, graying brow furrowing in deep confusion. You just explicitly said, truth, boy. Don't you dare play games with me in my courtroom. I am simply answering your question with the exact surgical precision it requires, Zion said, his tone entirely devoid of any intimidation, speaking as if he were instructing a slow student. I said truth because I knew the watch was there after Officer Jenkins violently threw me against the hood of his patrol car, unholstered his maglite, shined it directly into the bushes, pointed at the shiny object, and screamed, "Look what we found." At that specific, undeniable moment, 11:45 p.m., I became fully aware of the watch's existence. However, your question strategically failed to establish a timeline of prior knowledge, which is the absolute requisite element for mens rea, a guilty mind under Official Code of Georgia, annotated section 1687, theft by receiving stolen property. The entire courtroom froze. The stenographer's hands briefly stopped hovering over her keys, her jaw going slack. Prosecutor Davis dropped his expensive pen. It clattered loudly onto his desk and rolled onto the floor, utterly ignored. Judge Harold blinked rapidly, his aging brain struggling violently to process the dense, perfectly articulated legal jargon that had just casually rolled off the tongue of a 17-year-old kid wearing a faded thrift store hoodie. "Excuse me?" Harold stammered, his face immediately flushing a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. "What in God's name did you just say?" "I am saying, Your Honor, that your question was highly compounded and temporally ambiguous," Zion continued, leaning slightly forward, his eyes burning into the judge like hot coals. "You asked if I knew the watch was there." "I did. I knew it was there when the police pointed it out to me after my illegal detainment. But I did not ever possess the watch, nor did I have any prior knowledge of its placement, entirely negating both the actus reus, the guilty act, and mens rea, required for the state to pursue this charge. The core premise of your question was structurally and legally flawed." Harold's jaw clenched so tightly it looked like his molars might shatter. He was deeply accustomed to dealing with sobbing children, stammering teens, and silent, terrified youths, not a kid casually reciting the official code of Georgia, annotated entirely from memory. "Listen to me here, you little punk," Harold growled, his thin veneer of judicial impartiality beginning to violently crack apart. "You think memorizing a few big words makes you a trial lawyer? Let's try another one. Let's see how smart you really are. Truth or lie?" "You aggressively ran from the police when they approached the dark alley." Zion shook his head slowly, a look of profound disappointment crossing his face. "Lie. And the police report, which I sincerely assume the prosecution has actually taken the time to read, fully corroborates this fact. Arresting Officer Jenkins explicitly noted in his initial brief that I was kneeling, tying my shoe. I did not flee. I did not evade. In fact, Your Honor, under the landmark Supreme Court ruling Terry v. Ohio, the officers lacked any reasonable, articulable suspicion to even initiate the physical Terry stop in the first place, let alone the highly aggressive physical takedown that followed. Considering I was merely present in what they classify as a high-crime area, which the Supreme Court explicitly ruled in Illinois v. Wardlow is not, by itself, nearly enough to legally justify a search and seizure. A suffocating, heavy silence blanketed the courtroom. Mr. Gable, the public defender, was sitting sideways in his chair, staring at his teenage client with his mouth hanging wide open in utter disbelief. He had spent 3 grueling years in law school and barely passed the state bar on his second try, and this teenager was casually citing foundational Fourth Amendment jurisprudence with the casual, effortless ease of someone ordering a black coffee. Judge Harold's face was now a dark, bruised shade of purple. The thick veins in his thick neck bulged prominently against his tight white collar. His infallible game of truth or lie was blowing up in his face in real time, being systematically dismantled piece by tiny piece by a kid who was supposed to be a helpless, silent victim. "You arrogant little." Harold caught himself just in time, shooting a paranoid, desperate glance at the court stenographer. He had to maintain absolute control of the official record. He forced a sickeningly sweet, terrifyingly fake smile. "You seem to know an awful lot about the law, Zion, but knowing the law in a book and surviving the law in reality are two very, very different things. Truth or lie?" The late-night convenience store clerk, Mrs. Higgins, positively identified you as the exact boy who sprinted past her front window right before the police arrived, a sworn, signed eyewitness testimony. "What do you have to say to that, counselor?" Harold leaned back, crossing his massive arms across his chest. He was deeply confident this was the ultimate kill shot. Eyewitness testimony, regardless of how flawed, was the golden goose of swift convictions in his courtroom. Zion didn't flinch, he didn't even blink. Instead, he slowly reached his hand into his front hoodie pocket. "Truth or lie, Your Honor?" Zion asked softly, his voice dropping an octave. "Excuse me?" Harold barked, slamming his hand on the desk. "I ask the questions here. You answer them. It's only fair that I get a turn to play," Zion said, his eyes narrowing into cold, obsidian slits that radiated pure menace. "Truth or lie, Your Honor, under the supreme doctrine of Brady v. Maryland, the state prosecution is legally, ethically, and constitutionally obligated to turn over any and all exculpatory evidence to the defense counsel prior to trial. Failure to do so is a severe, actionable violation of a defendant's due process rights under the 14th Amendment, truth or lie. Prosecutor Davis suddenly went ghastly pale, all the blood draining from his face in a second. He began furiously and frantically shuffling through his thick stack of case files, raw panic radiating from his suddenly sweating forehead. Judge Harold slammed both of his hands flat on the mahogany desk, rising halfway out of his seat. "I am officially warning you, boy. Do not test my patience. Answer my direct question about the eyewitness identification." "I will," Zion said, calmly pulling a folded piece of white printer paper from his pocket. "Right after we openly discuss on the record why the prosecution deliberately suppressed the intersection traffic camera footage from Elm and 4th Street, which clearly and indisputably shows the actual perpetrator, a man approximately 6 inches taller than me, wearing a bright red windbreaker jacket, tossing the watch into the bushes while I was quietly walking on the complete opposite side of the street." Absolute chaos erupted. The gallery behind Zion, filled with bored citizens and waiting defendants, began to murmur loudly, the noise swelling like a rising tide. "Mr. Gable shot out of his chair, ignoring his spilled papers, staring intensely at the single piece of paper in Zion's steady hand. "What footage?" Gable demanded, spinning around to look fiercely at the terrified prosecutor. "Davis, did your office willfully withhold video evidence from my discovery packet?" Davis stood up, his knees visibly shaking, stammering uncontrollably. "Why, Your Honor, I can explain. The footage was. It was deemed deeply inconclusive by the detectives. The police department decided it was irrelevant to the immediate arrest report of this suspect. We absolutely weren't trying to hide." "Irrelevant?" Zion's voice cut through the noisy room, suddenly booming with a deep, commanding authority that belonged to a seasoned, 30-year litigator, not a 17-year-old high school student. He stepped away from the defense table, completely ignoring his lawyer's frantic gesture to sit down and be quiet. Zion was taking total, undeniable control of the courtroom space. "A high-definition video proving my absolute physical impossibility of committing the crime is considered irrelevant to the state? Sit down." Judge Harold roared, grabbing his heavy gavel and slamming it repeatedly, the sound echoing like a machine gun. "Bailiff, physically restrain the defendant. This is a court of law, not a three-ring circus." "No, Your Honor, it is a slaughterhouse," Zion fired back, standing his ground as the heavy-set bailiff approached hesitantly, unsure of how to handle the situation. Zion pointed a long, steady finger directly at Judge Harold's face. "And you have been the willing butcher. But today, the lamb brought a scalpel." The bailiff stopped dead in his tracks, deeply unnerved by the sheer, overwhelming dominance radiating from the young boy. "I am holding you in direct criminal contempt of court." Harold screamed, literal spit flying from his quivering lips, his face contorted in absolute rage. 30 days in county jail, starting right now. "Mr. Davis, draw up the paperwork immediately. We are moving to an immediate summary bench trial, and I find this defendant. You find me absolutely nothing." Zion yelled, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling, silencing the judge. He unfolded the paper in his hand with a crisp snap and slammed it down flat onto the defense table. "I personally filed a pro se motion of discovery yesterday morning directly with the Central Precinct's Records Department under the Freedom of Information Act, entirely bypassing this corrupt, lazy prosecutor's office. I have the time-stamped receipt right here. Furthermore, I also filed an official, extensively documented complaint with the Georgia Judicial Qualifications Commission regarding your little unconstitutional, truth or lie game, Your Honor." Judge Harold froze as if he had been struck by lightning. The dark, angry color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a deflated, sickly, terrified ghost. The wooden gavel slipped entirely from his sweaty, trembling grip, clattering loudly and pathetically onto the mahogany bench. You did what?" Harold whispered, his voice trembling so badly it was barely audible over the hum of the air conditioner. Canon 2, Rule 2.2 of the American Bar Association's Code of Judicial Conduct, Zion recited, pacing slowly and methodically in front of the elevated bench like a hungry predator circling wounded, bleeding prey. A judge shall uphold and apply the law, and shall perform all duties of judicial office fairly and impartially. For 22 long years, you have used illegal, psychological coercion to force false confessions from terrified minors who lacked the legal vocabulary to defend themselves against your tyranny. You repeatedly and willfully violated their Fifth and Sixth Amendment rights. You arrogantly bypassed their legal counsel. You turned this supposed sanctuary of justice into your own personal interrogation black site. Zion stopped his pacing and locked his cold eyes with the terrified, broken judge. I didn't just study the law to save myself today, Judge Harold. I studied it to entirely destroy you. The court stenographer was typing furiously, her eyes wide with shock and awe, ensuring she captured every single damning, explosive word on the permanent, unalterable court record. Zion turned his intense attention to Prosecutor Davis, who was practically melting into a puddle in his chair, wishing the floor would open up and swallow him. And you, Mr. Davis, withholding highly exculpatory video evidence simply to secure an easy, unopposed conviction on a minor to boost your quarterly numbers? That's not just a direct, career-ending violation of Brady v. Maryland. It is also a federal felony under 18 U.S.C. Section 242 deprivation of rights under color of law. You confidently didn't think a poor kid from the South Side would know how to independently draft a subpoena or file a FOIA request. You thought I was just another nameless, faceless file to push blindly across your desk to clear your afternoon. Zion turned back to the judge. The entire courtroom was holding its collective breath. You could hear a pin drop on the linoleum. So, let's play one final, high-stakes round of your favorite game, Judge Harold, Zion said, his voice dropping to a deadly, quiet, lethal whisper. Truth or lie? The exact moment I walk freely out of those heavy wooden doors, I am handing authenticated copies of the withheld video evidence, the FOIA receipts, and the full, unredacted stenographer's transcript of this morning's highly unconstitutional interrogation directly to the State Attorney General, the Regional Director of the ACLU, and every major news network broadcast in Atlanta. Judge Harold simply stared down at the boy. His breath came in shallow, ragged, panicked gasps. He looked desperately at the stenographer, who actively and purposefully avoided his gaze. He looked at the prosecutor, who had his head buried entirely in his hands, softly weeping. Harold realized, with a massive, crushing wave of nauseating terror, that the intricate trap hadn't been set for Zion Harris at all. The trap had been meticulously set for him, and the steel jaws had just snapped shut, shattering his life forever. Case. Harold choked out, his voice a pathetic, broken wheeze of a defeated tyrant. He couldn't even find his gavel to strike the sound block. He weakly slapped his bare, trembling hand against the wood. Case dismissed. With extreme prejudice, the defendant is entirely free to go. Zion didn't smile. He didn't celebrate or raise his fists in victory. He simply and methodically gathered his single piece of paper, folded it neatly back into his pocket, turned his back entirely on the disgraced, broken judge, and walked slowly down the center aisle of the courtroom. The heavy oak doors swung open into the bright hallway, and Zion stepped out, leaving a completely shattered, utterly ruined legal empire burning to the ground behind him. But Zion Harris was a young man of his absolute word. He didn't just walk away and forget the past. He walked out and immediately unleashed the storm. Within 48 hours, every major local and national news network was running the explosive story wall to wall. The bold headline, 17-year-old legal prodigy exposes decades of corruption in Truth or Lie Judge, dominated the evening airwaves and went massively viral across social media. True to his devastating promise, Zion had hand-delivered the pristine court transcripts and the hidden, undeniably exculpatory traffic camera footage directly to the Judicial Qualifications Commission, the FBI field office, and the hungry media. The resulting fallout was nothing short of apocalyptic. The hard, unforgiving karma that Judge Harold had arrogantly evaded for 2 decades finally came crashing down upon his head with terrifying, biblical force. The Judicial Review Board convened an emergency session and immediately suspended Harold without pay, stripping him of his robes and his dignity. A massive, deep-dive forensic audit into his 22-year career was aggressively launched. Hundreds of closed cases involving juvenile defendants who had been psychologically coerced by the abusive truth or lie game were suddenly reopened for immediate appeal. Swarms of high-powered civil rights lawyers descended upon the Fulton County Courthouse like sharks tasting blood in the water. But the consequences didn't stop at a mere lost job and a ruined pension. Because Harold had systematically and deliberately bypassed defense counsel to illegally interrogate vulnerable minors, the United States Department of Justice officially stepped in. Just 3 short months later, a federal grand jury indicted former Judge Arthur Harold on 47 counts of severe civil rights violations under 18 U.S.C. Section 242. The highly publicized federal trial was remarkably brief. Harold's own staggering arrogance, perfectly and permanently immortalized on the court record by the very stenographer he had ignored and abused, was his ultimate, inescapable undoing. The powerful man who had spent his entire adult life sadistically locking young minority men in iron cages was ultimately sentenced to 8 hard years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. When the presiding federal judge slammed the gavel down to finalize Harold's inescapable sentence, Harold wept openly and uncontrollably, completely transformed into a broken, disgraced shell of a human being. Prosecutor Davis certainly didn't fare much better in the aftermath. Facing permanent disbarment and severe criminal charges for the flagrant Brady violation and evidence tampering, Davis struck a cowardly plea deal, permanently surrendered his law license, and barely avoided a prison sentence. His once promising legal career was permanently annihilated. He ended up working quietly in the shadows as a night shift dispatcher for a suburban towing company, jumping every time a police siren wailed in the distance. As for Zion, the deeply flawed legal system that had carelessly tried to consume him whole ended up essentially handing him the keys to the kingdom. His brilliant, flawless dismantling of a corrupt sitting judge went incredibly viral, inspiring millions. It immediately caught the rapt attention of the Dean of Admissions at Georgetown University Law Center. By the end of the academic year, Zion wasn't just a graduating high school senior, he was the proud recipient of a full-ride, highly prestigious fast-track scholarship for their elite pre-law program. Furthermore, the regional director of the ACLU personally took up his older brother Marcus's tragic case completely pro bono. By brilliantly utilizing the ongoing, massive federal investigation into Fulton County's heavily corrupt judicial practices, they successfully proved prosecutorial misconduct and had Marcus's wrongful conviction permanently overturned. On a bright, crisp, beautiful autumn morning, exactly 2 years after that fateful, life-changing day in Courtroom 3B, Zion stood quietly outside the towering heavy iron gates of the state penitentiary. The deafeningly loud buzzer sounded, the heavy steel doors slid slowly open, and Marcus, wearing a gray sweatshirt and a bewildered, joyous smile, walked out into the warm, unfiltered sunlight. Zion stepped forward quickly and pulled his older brother into a fierce, desperately tight embrace, breathing in the scent of freedom. "You really did it, little bro," Marcus whispered, hot tears of relief streaming freely down his face as he hugged Zion tighter. "You actually beat them. You beat the whole damn system." Zion pulled back slightly, a genuine, warm, and rare smile finally breaking across his young face. He looked past the imposing prison walls, looking back toward the distant skyline of the city, toward the courthouse where justice was supposed to be inherently blind, but where he had painfully learned that sometimes, you have to violently force its eyes open to see the truth. "No, Mark," Zion said quietly, his brilliant, calculating mind already actively focusing on the thousands of other unjust cases desperately waiting to be fought. "I didn't just beat them, I rewrote the rules. Justice isn't always blind, sometimes, it just desperately needs someone smart enough, and brave enough, to rip the blindfold off and violently expose the deep corruption hiding underneath." Zion didn't just beat the terrifying Judge Harold at his own twisted, abusive game. He systematically dismantled a broken, heavily biased legal system from the inside out, using nothing but the sheer, unstoppable power of his intellect and the undeniable, absolute truth of the law. Hard karma always comes back around to collect its steep debts, and for those who arrogantly abuse their power and hurt the vulnerable, the inevitable fall is always truly devastating. If this incredible story of ultimate revenge, high-stakes legal drama, and brilliant, poetic justice gave you absolute chills, hit that like button right now to support the channel. Share this video with someone who loves seeing the underdog fight back and win, and please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell for more epic, dramatic stories of instant